In his final year on the throne, Ramesses III presided over the trial of 38 people who had conspired to kill him. He was already dead when the verdicts were handed down. The court continued anyway, in his name, by his authority, with his power to sentence and to erase. 38 people stood before a king who could no longer speak, and the system that king had built answered for him. I keep coming back to that image. A court in session, the chair at its head technically empty, and not one person in that room acting as though anything had gone wrong. That's not cruelty. That's not even cynicism. That's what a system looks like when it's working exactly as it was designed to. I've spent over 20 years with Egyptian sources, the papyri, the inscriptions, the administrative records that most documentaries never open. This channel is for people who are done with surface-level history. If that's you, subscribe. Let me know where you're watching from. I read every one. To understand how a dead man could still hold power over the living, you first have to understand the world he built while he was alive. Not the monuments, those are easy to see. The world underneath them. The one made of grain and obligation and 30 centuries of accumulated belief that the man on the throne was not entirely a man at all. Ramesses III came to power in approximately 1186 BCE during one of the most dangerous periods in the history of the ancient world. The Bronze Age, the interconnected network of civilizations that had dominated the Eastern Mediterranean for centuries, was collapsing. Not slowly, violently. The Hittite Empire, which had matched Egypt blow for generations, was gone. Ugarit, one of the great trading cities of the ancient world, had been burned to the ground and never rebuilt. Cyprus was disrupted. The Mycenaean palaces of Greece were falling silent, one by one, their administrative systems dissolving into a darkness that would last 300 years. Egypt was next, or it was supposed to be. In his 5th year, Ramesses III faced a Libyan coalition pushing across the western border, not a raid, but a migration. Entire populations moving with their families and their cattle, looking for land that still functioned. He stopped them. In his 8th year, something far larger came from the sea. A loose confederation of displaced peoples, the same groups that had already shattered his neighbors, moving down the Levantine coast in a combined land and naval assault. Ramesses III met them at the mouth of the Nile and stopped them too. The carvings at his temple complex at Medinet Habu record both campaigns in extraordinary detail. The sea battle in particular is one of the most vivid military reliefs in Egyptian art. Ships locked together, men in the water, the Pharaoh enormous above the chaos with his bow drawn, the outcome never in any doubt. That is the official version. The reliefs are real events. The scale, the composition, the absolute certainty of the outcome, that is political architecture. Every carving on those walls is a document, and like all documents, it tells you what the author needed to be believed. What the reliefs cannot show you, what they were specifically designed not to show you, is the cost. The military campaigns of Ramesses III were not free. They required soldiers, which required food, which required grain, which required a domestic agricultural system functioning at a level that could sustain both the civilian population and an active military. Egypt had managed this calculation for centuries, but the Bronze Age collapse had disrupted the trade networks that Egypt depended on for certain materials and revenues, and the military expenditure of the early reign had drawn heavily on reserves that were not easily replenished. And there was something else, something that would matter enormously by the end of the reign, which was the degree to which Ramesses III responded to his military victories by giving things away. To the gods. In enormous quantities, in permanent, irrevocable endowments. He was not the first pharaoh to endow the temples richly. Generosity toward the gods was one of the primary obligations of the king. It was, by the logic of their world, the mechanism by which the cosmic order was maintained. The pharaoh gave to the gods sustained the world. The world produced the grain that fed the people who built the monuments, that proclaimed the pharaoh's relationship with the gods. The loop was closed. The system was self-justifying. But Ramesses III gave on a scale that had no real precedent. We will come back to that. It is, in a sense, where the story actually ends. For now, the surface. The surface, in the early decades of his reign, was genuinely impressive. The temple at Medinet Habu is among the best preserved cult complexes in Egypt, and even in its current state, roofless in places, its paint faded to ghost traces on the stone, you can still feel what it was designed to communicate. This was a place that did not apologize for what it was. The walls are thick enough to muffle the outside world. The gateway towers, the Migdol, borrowed from Canaanite military architecture, a detail that still slightly surprises me when I stand in front of them, given how determinedly Egyptian the overall program is, rise to a height that makes the human figure at their base feel provisional. The decoration, inside and out, is relentless. Battle scenes, ritual scenes, the pharaoh in every posture of dominance and devotion, the gods receiving what is owed to them, the world in its correct alignment. Ramesses III celebrated his Sed festival, the royal jubilee, a ritual of renewal older than almost anything else in the Egyptian calendar, at least twice during his reign. The Sed festival was a statement. The king has been tested, the king has been found sufficient, the king continues. It required resources. It required the participation of every major temple in Egypt. It required, in short, the full cooperation of a state apparatus that was, in the final years of his reign, beginning to strain at its joints. But that strain was not yet visible, not officially. In the village of Deir el-Medina, on the west bank of the Nile, across from Thebes, a community of craftsmen and their families lived in a world that was small, ordered, and entirely legible. These were the people who built and decorated the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, a specialized workforce whose skills were irreplaceable and who were compensated accordingly in rations of grain and barley and fish and oil and linen. They knew their position, they knew their obligations, they knew who they answered to. The chain of authority above them ran upward through a foreman, through a series of scribal administrators, through the vizier, all the way to the name that appeared on every document they ever touched. The name that was not a name so much as a guarantee. The guarantee was that the system would function, that the rations would arrive, that the work would be compensated, that the dead king would rest in a tomb worthy of his divinity, and the living king would be fed, and the world would continue in the shape that 3,000 years of Egyptian civilization had decided was the correct one. For most of Ramesses III's reign, the guarantee held. The workers rose before dawn. They crossed the ridge that separated the village from the valley. They descended into the tombs they were cutting from the rock, following plans set by master architects, in corridors lit by oil lamps whose smoke left black traces on the ceilings that are still visible today. And they worked. The same work, day after day, year after year, with a precision and a consistency that is, even now, almost impossible to fully account for. The painted walls of these tombs are not merely beautiful, they are technically exact. The color proportions, the hieroglyphic accuracy, the spatial relationships between figures. These reflect a workforce that had been doing this specific thing for generations and had internalized its standards completely. This is the world Ramesses III governed. Not just the pharaoh's Egypt of battle reliefs and divine proclamations, but this. A foreman checking a worker's progress by lamplight. A scribe entering a ration figure into a column. A craftsman mixing pigment in the dark. And the system that connected all of them, the system that ran from that lamplight all the way to the throne, was not a system of fear exactly. Fear was part of it. But the deeper mechanism was belief. The Egyptians had constructed a world in which the pharaoh's role was not merely political, but cosmological. He was, in their understanding, the mediating figure between the human world and the divine order. If the Nile flooded correctly, if the crops grew, if Egypt's borders held, if the dead passed safely into whatever came next, these things happened because the pharaoh was in his correct relationship with the forces that governed them. This was not a metaphor. This was, to the people who lived inside it, simply true, which meant that the system could not be questioned without questioning everything, which meant that the people who eventually did question it, the people who decided that this particular pharaoh needed to be removed from the equation, were not just committing a crime. They were, by the logic of their own world, committing something closer to an act of cosmic sabotage. They did it anyway. But to understand why and how and what happened when the system had to process the rupture, you need to understand one more thing about the world Ramesses III had built. You need to understand what the palace actually was, not the public face of it, the interior, the part that the reliefs were also specifically designed not to show. In the 29th year of Ramesses III's reign, the workers of Deir el-Medina put down their tools and walked off the job. Not quietly, not apologetically. They crossed the boundary wall that separated the workers' village from the royal necropolis, sat down in front of the mortuary temples on the west bank, and refused to move until someone in the administrative chain above them explained where their grain had gone. 2 months of rations vanished. No explanation, no compensation, no acknowledgement that anything had gone wrong. The event is recorded in a papyrus now held in Turin, the same city that holds the judicial papyrus we will return to later. Written by a scribe who documented the dates, the quantities owed, the names of the officials who came to negotiate, and the specific language the workers used when they made their demands. The language is not revolutionary. There is no call for reform, no political manifesto, no demand that the pharaoh be held accountable for the shortfall. The workers wanted their grain, their fish, their oil. The precise calculation of goods that had been promised to them in exchange for work that only they knew how to do. This is the first recorded labor strike in human history. And the thing that strikes me most about it, having spent a long time with the administrative records from this period, is not the boldness, it's the specificity. These men were not angry in a general sense. They were angry about exact numbers. They knew what they were owed down to the unit of measurement because they had been keeping their own records, because in a world where the state controlled everything, a man's only protection was his ability to prove what the state had promised him. The rations eventually arrived, late and reduced, accompanied by assurances that the shortfall was temporary, an administrative problem, not a structural one. It happened again the following year, and the year after that. The strike papyrus is not an isolated document. The administrative records from Deir el-Medina in the final decade of Ramesses III's reign form a pattern. Repeated shortfalls, repeated negotiations, repeated promises that the system would correct itself. The grain did not flow because the state was struggling to collect it. The state was struggling to collect it because the agricultural surplus that had sustained Egypt's ambitions for centuries was contracting, slowly, unevenly, but unmistakably under the combined pressure of military expenditure, administrative inefficiency, a series of low Nile floods in certain years, and something else. Something that requires its own accounting. Ramesses III had been giving the land away, not literally in the sense of ceding territory, but through temple endowments, grants of land, cattle, grain, workers, and income made to the major religious institutions of Egypt in quantities that had no precedent in the historical record. He had been transferring the productive capacity of the state into institutional hands that were, by definition, permanent. A pharaoh could theoretically revoke a grant. In practice, once a temple's estates were established, once its administrative infrastructure was built around those resources, the political cost of reversal was prohibitive. The gods had been given their portion. To take it back was not a budgetary decision. It was a theological one. but we are getting ahead of ourselves. The Harris Papyrus, the document where all of that becomes fully visible, belongs to the end of this story, not the middle. What matters here is the texture of the world inside the palace walls during the years when the external surface still held. The royal harem was not what most people imagine when they hear the word. Not a pleasure house, not a private fantasy. An administrative institution, one of the most complex in the Egyptian state, with its own budget, its own staff, its own chain of command, its own productive function. The harem at Ghurab in the Fayum region south of the Delta was a working palace complex, a weaving workshop that produced fine linen for temple use and for royal gifts, a school for the children of diplomatic marriages, a residence for the secondary wives of the pharaoh and their households, and a bureaucracy capable of managing all of it simultaneously. Foreign princesses sent to Egypt as part of treaty arrangements lived here. Their children grew up here. The sons of secondary wives were educated here, trained in the administrative and military competencies appropriate to their status, which was the status of men who were close to the center of power but formally excluded from it. That exclusion was the hinge on which everything turned. In the Egyptian succession system, the principal wife held the primary position. Her sons had the clearest, most legitimate path to the throne. The sons of secondary wives existed in permanent adjacency, not excluded in the sense of being denied exactly. Egyptian succession was complicated, and history had produced pharaohs who came from less obvious lines, but structurally disadvantaged in a way that no amount of education or training or personal quality could fully overcome. Their futures depended, more than anything else, on the order in which people died and the political alignments that formed around each death. This is a very specific kind of pressure, the kind that builds over years, not days. And Ramesses III had many children, by multiple wives. The question of which son would follow him, a question that, in a reign as long as his had been live and unresolved for decades, generated exactly the kind of internal politics that a closed institution like the harem was perfectly designed to incubate and perfectly designed to hide. I want to be careful here because the sources are thin in certain places. We know that a conspiracy formed. We know who was named in the trial. We can reconstruct the general shape of the operation from the judicial and administrative papyri. What we cannot fully recover is the timeline. How long the plan was in development, when the first conversation happened, who approached whom first. The trial papyrus is a record of verdicts, not of origins. It tells us what was decided, not how the deciding began. What I can tell you is what the harem's structural position made possible. A closed institution with its own communication networks. Women who moved between the harem and other parts of the palace apparatus. Officials whose administrative roles gave them access to multiple departments simultaneously. A physician, treasury staff, army officers with connections to both the harem administration and the external military hierarchy. The conspiracy, when it was eventually uncovered, turned out to involve all of these. This was not a spontaneous act. It was organized over time by people who understood the system they were working inside, because the system was the only world they had ever known. The woman at the center of it was named Tiye. Not the famous Tiye, that is a different woman, a different century, the great queen of Amenhotep III, who appears in correspondence with foreign kings and whose face looks out from some of the most powerful portrait sculpture in the Egyptian canon. This Tiye is smaller in the record, a secondary wife, a name that survives only because it was written down in a list of people condemned to be erased. Without the trial, she would be nothing. A line in an administrative register, a ration allocation, a woman whose son grew up in the harem at Ghurab, learning to be almost royal and never quite royal enough. But the trial exists. And the trial gives her this. She thought, she planned. She looked at the structure she was inside, the one that had produced her son's adjacency and made it permanent, and she decided to do something about it. The something was catastrophic in its consequences and precise in its ambition. She did not want to burn the system down. She wanted her son on the throne. Those are not the same thing. One is rage, the other is calculation. And calculation in the Egyptian palace world required allies. The Rollin and Lee papyri, two documents that supplement the Turin judicial papyrus and deal specifically with the methods used in the conspiracy, record something that most modern accounts mention briefly and then move past: the use of wax figurines and written magical texts as components of the plot. The conspirators obtained or commissioned wax images, and texts were worked over them, designed, as they understood such things, to weaken the pharaoh's divine protection, to create vulnerability in the invisible architecture that surrounded the royal person and made him, in the reckoning of their world, something more than human. This was not superstition in the way we use that word. In the Egyptian understanding of reality, the image was not a representation of the person. It was an extension of the person. A spell worked on a wax figure was, by the logic of their theology, a real act with real consequences. The same logic governed the naming of the dead in tomb inscriptions, the smashing of enemy images in temple reliefs, the rituals performed over the body of the pharaoh at burial. The boundary between symbol and substance was not where we would draw it. They believed this would work. They acted accordingly. But the knife was always part of the plan too. Because belief, however complete, requires a practical component when what you are trying to accomplish is the death of a living man. The wax figures were preparation, softening, in their understanding, what the knife would have to do alone. The knife still had to be there, and the knife required someone inside the palace with access at a specific moment in a specific location. The conspiracy reached further inside the palace administration than almost anyone, after the fact, was comfortable admitting. Which is perhaps why the tribunal that eventually processed it was constructed with such deliberate thoroughness. 38 names, every department implicated, every rank accounted for. The system that had been infiltrated turning itself with complete institutional calm to the task of processing its own violation. The throat wound is 3 centimeters deep. That is what the CT scan found in 2012 when a team of researchers examined the mummy of Ramesses III using imaging technology that no Egyptian priest, no tomb official, no conspirator, and no judge could have imagined. A transverse cut across the throat, severing the trachea, cutting through to the cervical vertebrae, deep enough that the question of whether the man survived more than a few minutes after it was made is, in the clinical assessment of the researchers who analyzed the data, essentially closed. There was also a detached right thumb, consistent with a defensive wound, the kind a person sustains when they reach instinctively toward a blade that is already moving. Before the body was wrapped, someone pressed an amulet into the wound. The Eye of Horus, placed directly into the cut, held in place by the linen. Whether that was grief or procedure, I genuinely cannot tell you. Probably both. Probably, in the world these embalmers inhabited, the distinction between the two was not one they would have recognized. The mummy had been examined before, of course, unwrapped in the 19th century, studied repeatedly across the 20th, but the wound was not clearly identified until the CT scan made the soft tissue damage visible beneath what centuries of preservation had obscured. For a long time, the assassination was a matter of historical inference. We had the trial papyrus, we had the named conspirators, we had the sentences, but the physical evidence of the act itself was, in the most literal sense, wrapped up and put away. The 2012 study changed that. The body had been carrying the proof the whole time. Accepted is perhaps the better word than confirmed. There is still some scholarly discussion around the precise interpretation of the imaging data, and the question of exactly when Ramesses III died relative to the tribunal proceedings remains genuinely unresolved. But the wound itself is not seriously disputed. Something happened to this man's throat that did not happen accidentally. The cut is too clean, too deliberate, too precisely located for any other reading. What we do not have is a witness account. No one who was present at the moment of the attack left a record that survives. The trial papyrus names the conspirators and their roles, but does not narrate the event itself. It is a legal document, not a chronicle. The administrative papyri from the period immediately following tell us that the tribunal was convened, that it operated under royal authority, that it processed its cases and delivered its verdicts. They do not tell us what the corridors of the palace looked like the morning after. They do not tell us who found him or what was said, or how long it took for the machinery of state to absorb what had happened and decide how to respond. That silence is, in itself, a kind of data, because what the silence tells us is that the system handled the event without, publicly, officially, documentarily, breaking stride. There was no interregnum recorded as a crisis. There was no formal announcement of chaos. There was a tribunal conducted in the Pharaoh's name, which processed 38 conspirators with bureaucratic precision. And then there was a new Pharaoh, Ramesses IV, the son who had been designated as heir, and the administrative machinery continued. The groove was too deep to be interrupted by something as contingent as a king's death. But to understand how the night itself unfolded, you have to go back further, to the weeks and months before the blade, to the question of how a conspiracy that reached into multiple departments of the palace apparatus managed to stay hidden long enough to reach the point of action. The answer, most likely, is that it nearly didn't. The Rollin and Lee papyri, which deal with the magical components of the plot, were probably produced as part of the investigation. Documents compiled or dictated after the conspiracy was uncovered, recording what the interrogations revealed about method. This means we are reading the conspiracy through the lens of people who were already caught, already confessing or being made to confess, already inside the processing machinery of the tribunal. Their testimony is real, but it is testimony given under conditions that make absolute precision about sequence and intent very difficult to establish. What we can say is this: the operation was multi-stage. The ritual preparation, the wax figures, the written texts came first or ran concurrently with the logistical planning. The conspirators who had access to the harem's internal communication networks used them to coordinate with people outside the harem walls. A physician named Pabakamen appears in the trial record. His role seems to have involved providing access, knowledge of the palace's internal geography, possibly knowledge of the pharaoh's physical vulnerabilities and routines. Army officers are named, men whose presence in certain locations would not have seemed unusual to the guards who might otherwise have raised questions. This is what organized betrayal looks like inside a closed institution. Not dramatic, methodical. And Tiye herself? What was her role in the final stages? The papyrus identifies her as the originating intelligence of the conspiracy, the woman who set it in motion and whose son's elevation was its purpose. Whether she was present at the moment of the attack, whether she knew the exact night it would happen, whether she spent those hours in some part of the harem complex waiting for word, none of that is recorded. She is named at the beginning of the list and sentenced at its conclusion. Everything between is inferred. I think about her sometimes, not sympathetically exactly, but with the kind of attention you give to someone who made a decision that ended everything. She had spent years inside a system that gave her son proximity to the throne and then built walls around that proximity that no amount of virtue or patience could dissolve. She concluded that the walls had to be removed by other means. The calculation was not irrational within the logic of her world. The execution, the conspiracy's detection, the trial, the sentences was catastrophic. But the calculation itself had a cold coherence that the record, if you read it carefully, does not entirely erase. The attack most likely occurred in the palace complex at Medinet Habu, or possibly at the Harem Palace at Gurob. Scholars have argued for both, and the sources do not resolve it. What the location would have required in either case was inside access, Someone who could arrange for the right guards to be absent, the right doors to be open, the right moment to be created in the flow of a palace night. The army officers named in the conspiracy probably provided this. A palace at night is not empty. It is staffed, watched, administered even in darkness. And the people who moved through it unquestioned were the people the system recognized as belonging there. The blade found the throat. The thumb reached toward it. The Eye of Horus went into the wound. And then, the system. What happened next is the part of this story that I find genuinely difficult to get my thinking around, even after everything I've read. Not the tribunal itself. The tribunal is documented, explicable, coherent within its own logic. What I find hard is the speed of the pivot. The conspiracy had aimed at the collapse of the existing order, or at least its reshaping around a different succession. What it produced, instead, was a demonstration of the existing order's resilience that was, if anything, more complete than anything the conspirators could have anticipated. The system did not mourn. It did not panic. It organized. 38 people were identified, named, ranked, categorized, tried, and sentenced with the kind of administrative thoroughness that suggests the process had been prepared for. Not this specific conspiracy, but the category of conspiracy, the possibility of internal betrayal, the procedural question of what the state did when the state itself had been attacked. The answer was exactly this: a tribunal of 12 judges, senior officials drawn from the military and civil hierarchy, given specific powers, specific instructions, and, this is the detail that stays with me, specific warnings. The judges were told not to be too harsh and not to be too lenient. They were told to find what was true and act on it. They were told not to associate with the accused outside the proceedings. At least 3 of them did anyway, and those 3 ended up on the list. That detail, the judges, who were also conspirators, processed by the same machinery they had been appointed to operate, is almost too neat to be true. But it is in the papyrus, column by column. The system catching itself in the act of being human and filing the paperwork. The tribunal convened in the name of Ramesses III. Whether Ramesses III was alive to know it or dead and past knowing anything, the name functioned. The authority was intact. The sentences would be real regardless of whether the hand that authorized them was still warm. This is what Tiye had underestimated. Not the guards, not the access problem, not even the risk of detection. She had underestimated the degree to which the system did not actually require the person at its center to continue operating. She had aimed at the man. What she had actually struck was an institution, and institutions do not bleed. The papyrus begins with a list of names, not their real names, not yet. The document uses their titles first, their former positions, the ranks they held inside the palace apparatus before the conspiracy made those ranks a liability. This is deliberate. The tribunal is establishing, before it does anything else, the scope of what had been corrupted. Not just individuals, departments, offices, the trusted infrastructure of the state itself, named and catalogued before being condemned. Reading the Turin judicial papyrus, and I should be honest about what that experience is actually like, because it is not what you might expect, does not feel dramatic. It feels like reading a very thorough inventory. The bureaucratic register is almost unbroken from start to finish. The same scribal hand, the same column structure, the same measured progression from charge to verdict to sentence, case after case. The language barely shifting in tone between a death sentence and a dismissal from office. The system processed these 38 people the way it processed grain deliveries and ration accounts, completely, methodically, without visible emotion. That flatness is the most unsettling thing about it. The 12 judges appointed to the tribunal were senior men. Their names appear in other administrative records from the period. This was not a panel assembled from obscurity, but drawn from the functioning elite of the Egyptian state. They were given written instructions that survive in partial form and that specify with remarkable precision what was expected of them. Investigate the charges, evaluate what the interrogations produced, determine what was true, and act accordingly. Do not be swayed by the positions the accused had formerly held. Do not allow personal connection to influence the verdict. Find the truth and close the file. 3 of the 12 were themselves on the list by the time the proceedings concluded. The papyrus records their cases in the same register as everyone else's. Their former rank as judges is noted. Their transgression, associating with the accused outside the tribunal, which in context almost certainly means something closer to active collaboration than a social indiscretion, is recorded. Their sentences are delivered. The system that appointed them also processed them without apparent hesitation, without any visible acknowledgement that there was something specifically disturbing about a court that had to try its own members for the crime it had been assembled to adjudicate. Maybe that acknowledgement existed somewhere. In a conversation between officials, in a private letter, in someone's internal reaction that was never committed to papyrus. But it is not in the record. The record simply continues. The accused were divided, roughly, into categories, not formal legal categories in the way a modern court would establish them, but functional ones that the tribunal seems to have applied consistently. Those who had originated or directed the conspiracy occupied the most serious tier. Those who had participated actively, carrying messages, providing access, performing the ritual operations, occupied the middle tiers. Those who had known and failed to report, or who had been drawn into peripheral roles without full understanding of the conspiracy's ultimate aim, occupied the lower tiers. The sentences tracked this hierarchy, though not with perfect consistency. There are anomalies in the record that scholars have argued over for decades, cases where the sentence seems either heavier or lighter than the tier of participation would suggest. I don't have a clean explanation for those anomalies. The papyrus doesn't offer one. Some of them may reflect information that was produced during the interrogations, cooperation, perhaps, or the naming of additional conspirators that softened or hardened the tribunal's response in ways the document doesn't explicitly record. Some of them may simply reflect the human variability of 12 judges working under pressure, applying a framework that was serious without being perfectly codified. The Egyptian legal system was sophisticated, but it was not a modern court with a standardized sentencing grid. Judgment was, in the end, judgment. The name stripping is where the document becomes something other than a bureaucratic record. In Egyptian culture, the name was not a label. It was a constituent part of the person, as real and as essential as the physical body, as necessary to the afterlife as the heart that would be weighed against the feather of Ma'at. To erase a name from a monument was to damage the person it belonged to, potentially permanently, in ways that extended beyond death. The practice of damnatio memoriae, the systematic erasure of a hated figure from the record, was not primarily punitive in the political sense. It was ontological. It aimed at the existence of the person, not just their reputation. The tribunal's version of this was to rename the condemned. A man whose name invoked the sun, god Ra, whose name meant, in translation, something like Ra is his strength or Ra fashions him, was entered into the record with a replacement name meaning Ra hates him. A woman whose name honored the goddess Mut was renamed in the papyrus with a phrase that translates approximately as she who does not exist. Others received similar substitutions, divine associations inverted, positive meanings reversed, the names their parents had given them replaced with condemnations that would follow them into whatever came after death. This was the sentence before the sentence. Before the execution, before the forced suicide, before the mutilation, the name went first. And the thing that I find genuinely hard to sit with, having spent time in these records, is that the people receiving these renamed designations were also, in the cosmology they had grown up inside, being harmed in a way they would have experienced as real. They believed what their culture had taught them about the name. The renaming was not just humiliation. By the logic of their world, it was damage. The system that condemned them understood that and used it. Pentawer's case is recorded separately from the others, and in language that is notably more careful than the surrounding entries. He is identified by his former name, his real name, and by his relationship to Tiye, and by the specific role he was intended to play, the son who would be elevated once the conspiracy succeeded, the alternative Pharaoh, the reason the whole operation had been set in motion. His sentence is given in a phrase that the translation tradition renders as being permitted to take his own life or being given the punishment of death by his own hand. The precise wording in the hieratic is slightly ambiguous, but the meaning is not. He was handed the means of his own death and instructed to use them. The logic behind this was Egyptian to its foundations. A man of royal blood, however illegitimate his claim, however clear his guilt, could not be publicly executed in the same register as a treasury official or a palace guard. The blood created a category problem for the tribunal, and the tribunal solved it with characteristic institutional elegance. The death had to occur, but it had to occur at one remove from the state's direct hand. Pentawer killed himself. Technically. The system maintained its categories to the end. I keep thinking about what that room looked like. Whether it was a room at all, or a courtyard, or simply a threshold past which he was pushed and a door that was closed behind him. Whether anyone stayed. Whether anyone was required to confirm the outcome, and if so, what they were required to write in the column afterward. The papyrus closes his case in a single line and continues to the next entry. One line. The women named in the conspiracy, those who had carried messages between the harem and the outside, those who had participated in the ritual operations, appear in the lower sections of the papyrus and receive sentences that range from death to mutilation to disgrace. The papyrus does not treat their gender as a mitigating circumstance. Each case is processed in the same register as the men above them. What their lives had been before the conspiracy is not recorded, their former names in most cases, their former positions noted, then the replacement names, then the verdict. What the conspiracy's full social geography looked like from inside, how these women understood what they were participating in, what they believed would happen if it succeeded, what they were promised, is entirely absent from the record. The record was not written to preserve their perspective. It was written to close their cases. Among the individuals whose sentences seem anomalous, lighter than their apparent level of involvement might have warranted, there are 2 or 3 who received mutilation rather than death. Ears and nose removed, the body preserved, the life continued, but marked permanently and visibly as something the state had processed and found wanting. Whether these individuals had provided information during the investigation that resulted in leniency, whether their positions in the court hierarchy created a category problem similar to Pentawer's, whether simple inconsistency of judgment accounts for it, the papyrus does not say. And the 3 judges, the ones who had been appointed to find the truth and had instead been found inside the conspiracy themselves, their cases close the most disturbing loop in the document. One appears to have been executed, another mutilated. The third's sentence is less clear in the surviving text. They had been given the mechanism of justice and had used it to protect the people the mechanism was supposed to expose. When the exposure happened anyway, the mechanism processed them with the same efficiency it had processed everyone else. The system did not distinguish between the betrayed and the betrayers in the matter of procedure. Everyone got a column, everyone got a verdict, everyone got a line. By the time the tribunal concluded, 38 cases had been opened and closed. The palace continued to function. The tomb workers at Deir el-Medina continued their work in the valley. The grain accounts continued to be maintained. Somewhere in the administrative hierarchy, a scribe entered a final figure into a final column, rolled the papyrus closed, and set it aside. The file was complete. What remained, what the tribunal could not process because it was not a crime but a consequence, was the question of what Ramesses III had actually left behind. Not the conspiracy, which was now closed. Not the mummy in its wrappings with the amulet pressed into its throat. The other thing. The 40 meters of papyrus that recorded in the exhaustive language of a man who believed he was ordering the world into a permanent shape, everything he had given away. 40 meters. Unrolled completely, the Great Harris Papyrus is longer than the width of a tennis court. It is the longest papyrus ever recovered from ancient Egypt, longer than any administrative record, any religious text, any literary composition that has survived from the entirety of Egyptian civilization. It was found in the 19th century near Medinet Habu, in circumstances that were less than ideal for preservation, and it arrived in the collections of the British Museum in pieces that scholars spent years reassembling into the document we have now. What it contains, from its opening columns to its close, is an accounting. Not a narrative, not a proclamation of military victory, not a theological treatise. An accounting of land, cattle, workers, grain, silver, gold, ships, gardens, orchards, and personnel, all of it given in the name of Ramesses III to the temples of Egypt. The document moves through the major religious institutions systematically. Amun at Karnak first, because Amun was the dominant deity of the new kingdom, and the temple at Karnak was the wealthiest religious institution in the ancient world. Then Ra at Heliopolis, then Ptah at Memphis, then the smaller temples and local shrines, each receiving their itemized portion of the king's generosity. Each endowment recorded in the same careful scribal hand, column after column after column of figures that accumulate as you read into something almost vertiginous in its scale. The document was either dictated by Ramesses III in the final period of his reign, a kind of living testament, a record of what he had given and what the gods therefore owed Egypt in return, or composed in his name by Ramesses IV immediately after his father's death, as a political act designed to cement the legitimacy of the new reign by invoking the authority of the old one. Scholars have argued both positions with genuine force, and the question is not cleanly resolved. What is clear is that the document functioned as a guarantee. These donations had been made, they were permanent, they were irrevocable, and anyone who thought otherwise would be acting against the explicit will of one of Egypt's greatest pharaohs. Whether that pharaoh was alive to enforce the guarantee is, in this context, almost beside the point. The document enforced it for him. If you've ever watched an institution make a decision whose consequences it would never live to face, a government passing legislation that binds its successors for generations, a corporation restructuring itself around assumptions that won't be tested until everyone who made them is gone, you understand something about what the Harris Papyrus represents. It is that, scaled to a civilization, written in a script that most of the people it would affect could not read, sealed with the authority of a man who was either dying or already dead. The numbers, when you try to translate them into something graspable, are staggering. The temple of Amun at Karnak, by the time the Harris Papyrus closes its accounting, controlled agricultural estates across multiple regions of Egypt. Hundreds of thousands of head of cattle, tens of thousands of workers, and an income in grain and precious materials that made it functionally a state within the state. The figure most commonly cited in the scholarly literature, that the temples of Amun alone controlled something approaching a third of Egypt's arable land by the end of the 20th dynasty, is a reconstruction, not a direct reading from the papyrus, and I want to be precise about that. The exact proportion is debated. What is not debated is the direction of travel. The temples were accumulating and the crown was diminishing, and the Harris Papyrus is the document that made that process irreversible. Ramesses III's successors inherited this. There were 9 of them across roughly a century, all named Ramesses by the convention that had calcified around the greatest name of the dynasty, as if the name itself could transmit the capacity of the man who had first made it famous. Ramesses IV, who most likely commissioned or at least authorized the Harris Papyrus, reigned for approximately 6 years. Ramesses V, 6 years. Ramesses VI, 7 years. The reigns grew shorter, the resources thinner, the administrative infrastructure of the state increasingly unable to perform the basic functions that had sustained Egyptian civilization for 3,000 years. The workers at Deir el-Medina kept records through all of it. The strike that had occurred in year 29 of Ramesses III's reign was not an isolated event. It was the first clear signal of a structural problem that would not be solved, because the structure that produced it was not being addressed. The ration shortfalls continued through the reigns of Ramesses III's successors, worsening as each new pharaoh found the administrative machinery slightly more depleted than his predecessor had left it. The papyri from Deir el-Medina in the reigns of Ramesses IX and Ramesses XI read, in places, like a civilization conducting a slow audit of its own collapse. Grain accounts that no longer balance, ration promises that can no longer be kept, a workforce continuing to show up for work on tombs for pharaohs whose names would barely be remembered by anyone born 3 reigns later. And through all of it, the temples grew. The high priest of Amun, the administrative head of the wealthiest religious institution in Egypt, the man responsible for managing the estates and revenues that Ramesses III and his predecessors had endowed, was, by the end of the 20th dynasty, governing Upper Egypt with an independence from the royal house that would have been unthinkable a century earlier. Not through conquest, not through rebellion, through the perfectly legal, perfectly documented accumulation of resources that the pharaohs themselves had granted in perpetuity in the name of divine obligation. The last pharaoh of the new kingdom, Ramesses XI, ended his reign in a country effectively divided between the priestly administration controlling the south and a military governor controlling the north. The throne that Ramesses III had defended against the Sea Peoples, that he had celebrated with said festivals and enormous temple walls and the most impressive monument-building program of the late New Kingdom, that throne commanded, by the time his dynasty exhausted itself, a fraction of what it had commanded when he first sat on it. He had not intended this. I want to say that clearly because the alternative reading, that the Harris Papyrus was a cynical act, a knowing transfer of resources designed to benefit the priesthood at the expense of the state, does not survive contact with what we know about how Egyptian kingship worked. Ramesses III gave to the gods because that is what pharaohs did, because the ideology of kingship demanded it, because the victories he had won needed to be acknowledged in the only currency the gods accepted. The scale of his giving reflected the scale of his victories and the scale of his ambition to be remembered as a righteous king. The consequences were not intended, they were structural. But unintended consequences, at the scale of a civilization, do not become less real because they were not planned. The New Kingdom, the period of Egyptian history that produced Thutmose III, and Hatshepsut and Akhenaten and Ramesses II and the great temple complexes and the Valley of the Kings and the diplomatic correspondence that connected Egypt to every major power in the ancient world, ended functionally with the 20th dynasty. The third intermediate period that followed was not a catastrophe in the dramatic sense. Egypt continued. People were born and died and worshipped and buried. The Nile flooded and receded. The administrative machinery, in various diminished forms, kept turning. But the unified, centralized, pharaonically commanded Egypt of the New Kingdom was gone, and it did not come back in the same form. Ramesses III was the last pharaoh who could credibly claim to have held it together, and the document that bears the most complete record of his reign, the one that his successor either composed or commissioned in his name, the one that runs 40 meters and accounts for every cow and every field and every worker assigned to every temple in the kingdom, is also, if you read it with that knowledge in mind, a kind of long, meticulous, entirely unintentional farewell. The stone at Medinet Habu still stands. The reliefs are still there. The sea battle, the Libyan campaigns, the Sed festivals, the Pharaoh enormous above every scene, the world in its correct alignment. The outer walls still carry the register of his victories. The inner rooms still hold the color of his devotion. Tourists walk through it. Scholars photograph it. The light in the late afternoon hits the gateway towers in a way that makes them look, briefly, like something outside of time. But in a storage room in the British Museum, 40 meters of papyrus. Record what the walls were designed to conceal, a state giving itself away, column by column, in the handwriting of a system so complete and so self-convinced that it could not see what it was doing even as it did it with absolute precision. The system survived Ramesses III. It survived the tribunal. It survived the conspiracy and the knife and the amulet pressed into the wound and the 38 names replaced with condemnations. It processed all of it and filed it and moved on. What it could not survive was itself. That is the thing the monuments don't tell you. Not because they're lying, though they are, in the specific ways that all monuments lie, but because the question the monuments were never designed to ask is the one that the papyri, if you stay with them long enough, eventually force you to confront. What does a system do when its own logic is the thing destroying it? The answer, in Egypt's case, was the same thing it always did. It continued, it administered, it kept records, it filed the grain accounts and noted the shortfalls and processed the strikes and named the dead and renamed the condemned and rolled the papyrus closed and set it aside and started a new column. Until one day the column ran out. If this changed how you see Egypt, even slightly, that's why I make these.